6 months after my husband of 50 years moved out to live with his 29-year-old secretary, I sat silently at the head of the boardroom table, watching the color drain from his face as the legal team revealed that I controlled 62% of the company he had always claimed as his. Some lessons about partnership can't be learned from books or business school. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to reinvent yourself after betrayal, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video about finding strength after devastation is something you won't want to miss. I, Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, was never meant to be a businesswoman. Born in 1951 in the working-class neighborhood of Riverdale in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I came from a world where women were expected to become wives and mothers, not corporate strategists or financial decision-makers. My father, James Donovan, worked as a foreman at the Allegheny Steel Works. My mother, Ruth, transformed our modest two-bedroom home into a place of warmth and wisdom, managing household finances with a precision that could have balanced the national budget. "The real wealth in this world isn't what's in your wallet," my mother would say while recording every penny in her leather-bound household ledger. "It's what you've built together with those you trust." This philosophy guided our family's approach to everything from household economics to community relationships. While we had little materially, we understood the value of mutual investment and shared growth. My childhood was shaped by these practical demonstrations of partnership. I watched my mother transform patched curtains into new dresses when money was tight. I observed my father repair neighbors' automobiles on weekends, creating a network of reciprocal support that carried our community through labor strikes and economic downturns. Most importantly, I witnessed how my parents made every significant decision together. Their partnership a living example of the principle that shared burdens become lighter while shared joys multiply. By 16, I had developed my own understanding of balanced relationships. While other girls focused on finding boyfriends who were handsome or popular, I evaluated potential partners based on how they approached shared projects and whether they acknowledged others' contributions. This peculiar perspective made me something of an oddity among my peers, who couldn't understand why I declined dates with the football captain but happily partnered with the quiet boy from physics class for the science fair. "Most people look for someone who completes the picture they already have of themselves," my father explained when I questioned whether my priorities were unusual. "Wise people look for someone who sees the world as a canvas they want to paint together, where both hold brushes and both have a say in the composition." This vision of partnership became my guiding star through adolescence and into early adulthood. By the time I entered nursing school at Pittsburgh General Hospital's training program, the highest education my family could afford, I had developed a clear understanding of what I valued in relationships, even if those values ran counter to the romantic fantasies portrayed in magazines and movies. It was during my final year of nursing training that I met Edward Whitfield, a young business school graduate who had recently joined his family's medical equipment company. He arrived at the hospital to discuss a new supply contract, and I had been assigned to demonstrate how certain equipment was actually used by nursing staff in daily practice. Where other executives had dismissed nurses' practical feedback, Edward listened intently, taking detailed notes and asking thoughtful questions. "The people who use the tools daily understand more about what works than any designer in an office could," he observed during our third meeting, a perspective that registered as remarkable in an era when women's professional opinions were routinely dismissed. "A company that doesn't listen to that wisdom is building on sand." This respect for practical knowledge aligned perfectly with the values I had developed throughout my upbringing. Our professional interaction gradually evolved into coffee discussions about hospital operations, then dinner conversations about our respective backgrounds and aspirations. Edward's family wealth placed him in a social stratum far removed from my working-class origins, yet he approached our developing relationship with a refreshing lack of pretension. "What fascinates me about you, Margaret," he said during a pivotal conversation months into our courtship, "is that you evaluate everything based on substance rather than appearance. You've never once seemed impressed by my family name or business position. You're more interested in whether my decisions make practical sense. That's because lasting partnerships are built on shared values and mutual respect, I replied, recognizing the rare alignment that would eventually form the foundation of our marriage. Everything else is just decoration. Our engagement in 1972 surprised both our families for different reasons. My parents worried that Edward's privileged background would eventually create unbridgeable distances between us, while his family questioned whether a nurse without social connections or inherited wealth would fit into the corporate world they navigated. These concerns reflected the class distinctions that defined that era, but neither Edward nor I allowed external expectations to override our fundamental compatibility. We married in a ceremony that balanced different traditions, held at his family's country club, but featuring the Polish foods and folk dances that honored my grandmother's heritage. From the beginning, we approached marriage as genuine partnership, rather than the conventional husband-dominant structure common in that period. While Edward focused on expanding Whitfield Medical Supplies beyond its regional boundaries, I continued my nursing career, providing essential insights about hospital operations that informed his business strategy. Margaret understands what happens on the front lines of healthcare in ways I never could from executive meetings, he would explain when colleagues questioned why he consulted his wife on business matters. Her perspective prevents us from developing products that look good in boardroom presentations but fail in actual clinical settings. This collaborative approach extended to our financial management as well. Against conventional wisdom that suggested husbands should control family finances, we established joint decision-making processes for everything from daily expenses to long-term investments. When Edward's father expressed concern about this arrangement, suggesting it undermined proper household authority, Edward's response reflected the values that had drawn us together. The strongest structures have multiple support points, not a single pillar, he observed with the architectural metaphor that characterized his thinking. Our partnership makes both of us stronger and our decisions better. This philosophy yielded significant fruits as Whitfield Medical expanded from regional supplier to national corporation throughout the 1970s and 1980s. While Edward navigated business development and corporate relationships, my healthcare insights guided product development and marketing approaches. Though I maintained my nursing career until our second child arrived, my contributions to company strategy continued through formal consulting arrangements that acknowledged the value I brought to the organization. When Jonathan arrived in 1975, followed by Catherine in 1978, we applied the same partnership principles to parenting. Against the gender-defined parenting roles of that era, Edward participated actively in childcare, while I maintained professional involvement through part-time consulting. We made educational decisions jointly, weighing academic opportunities against family cohesion when prestigious schools recruited our children. The measure of successful parenting isn't producing children who achieve independently, Edward would say when colleagues boasted about sending children to elite boarding schools, but raising adults who understand how to build meaningful partnerships in whatever path they choose. This approach shaped our children's development in ways that became increasingly apparent as they matured. Both developed the capacity to evaluate relationships based on substance rather than status, to recognize the value of different perspectives, and to approach challenges collaboratively rather than competitively. Throughout these decades of building both family and business, Edward and I maintained the foundational partnership that had initially brought us together. As Whitfield Medical grew from national supplier to international corporation in the 1990s, our collaborative approach evolved to address increasingly complex decisions. The small company that had once manufactured basic medical equipment now produced sophisticated technologies through global supply chains, requiring governance structures far more complicated than the founder-led organization Edward had inherited. When corporate advisors recommended transitioning to a board structure with professional governance rather than family management in 1997, we approached this evolution through careful joint consideration focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term control. A company shouldn't depend on a single person's leadership to thrive, Edward observed during these discussions. Creating proper governance ensures that what we've built together continues benefiting patients and healthcare providers, regardless of who holds specific positions. The resulting restructuring established a corporate board with independent directors, alongside family representatives, creating professional governance while maintaining the values-based approach that had distinguished the company. What wasn't widely understood outside our immediate family circle was the specific allocation of controlling interests established through this reorganization. Decisions documented in complex legal arrangements, but not publicized within the broader organization. As we entered the new millennium, our partnership appeared to maintain the strength and balance that had characterized it throughout the previous decades. We celebrated our 30th anniversary by establishing the Whitfield Foundation for Healthcare Access, focusing on bringing medical technologies to underserved communities. Our children had established their own families and careers, returning for regular gatherings that maintained close intergenerational connections. Yet beneath this apparent stability, subtle shifts were occurring that I recognized but initially dismissed as temporary adjustments rather than fundamental changes. Edward's 70th birthday in 2020 seemed to trigger new patterns of behavior and perspective that gradually diverged from the values we had shared throughout our marriage. His focus increasingly shifted toward external validation and recognition rather than substantive contribution. "At my age, I want to enjoy the fruits of what I've built," he began saying with increasing frequency, a framing that notably replaced the we language that had characterized our partnership for decades. "I've earned the right to focus on what pleases me rather than always considering every stakeholder's perspective." This shift manifested in various decisions that contradicted our previously shared values: purchasing a luxury vacation property without meaningful consultation, engaging in conspicuous consumption that contrasted sharply with our historically modest lifestyle, and gradually withdrawing from the collaborative decision-making processes that had defined our relationship. Most concerning was his growing preoccupation with maintaining youthful appearance and lifestyle, evidenced through everything from aesthetic procedures to dramatically changed social patterns. The most visible manifestation of this evolution was his increasingly close relationship with his new executive assistant, Alexis Chambers, hired in 2021 as the company expanded its international operations. 29 years old with a recently completed MBA and carefully cultivated professional image, Alexis represented exactly the external validation Edward increasingly sought, admiringly attentive to his business accomplishments, enthusiastically supportive of his lifestyle indulgences, and conspicuously impressed by the corporate success story he had begun narrating with noticeably reduced acknowledgement of the partnership that had actually built the company. "Alexis understands the business world today in ways people from earlier eras simply can't," he began commenting with increasing frequency, the implied criticism of my perspectives becoming gradually more explicit. "She helps me navigate modern corporate expectations without being constrained by outdated thinking." The subtle dismissal of 5 decades of successful partnership as outdated thinking registered painfully, but I initially approached these concerning patterns with the same collaborative problem-solving that had addressed previous challenges throughout our marriage. I suggested counseling to discuss changing relationship expectations, proposed renewed joint projects that might reconnect us to shared purpose, and attempted to initiate conversations about whether underlying health concerns might be influencing his dramatically shifted priorities. "I don't need psychological analysis or medical evaluation," he dismissed with uncharacteristic impatience. "I'm simply living more authentically now instead of constantly compromising my preferences to accommodate others' expectations." This reframing, recasting our mutual partnership as imposed constraint rather than shared strength, revealed how profoundly his understanding of our relationship had shifted. The man who had once valued collaborative decision-making now interpreted joint consideration as unnecessary limitation. The husband who had proudly built business success through partnership now narrated a story of individual achievement constrained by outdated obligations. The culminating moment arrived on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday evening in April 2022. I had prepared dinner as we discussed plans for our upcoming 50th anniversary celebration, a conversation I hoped might reconnect us to the partnership foundation that seemed increasingly distant in Edward's recent behavior. About the anniversary, he began with uncharacteristic formality after extended silence. I think we need to acknowledge some significant changes in our situation. What followed was a statement so disconnected from our shared history that it momentarily seemed like someone else entirely had replaced the partner with whom I had built 5 decades of life and legacy. I've given 50 years to this marriage, and the obligations it required, he continued with practiced delivery that suggested prior rehearsal. At 72, I deserve the opportunity to experience life differently before it's too late. Alexis helps me feel energized and appreciated in ways that our relationship simply doesn't provide anymore. I've decided to move out and explore this connection without the constraints of our current arrangement. The carefully constructed statement with its corporate language of current arrangement, rather than marriage or partnership, revealed how completely Edward had reconstructed our shared history to justify decisions already made. This wasn't opening discussion about relationship challenges. It was delivering notification of unilateral action determined without consultation or consideration of 5 decades of mutual investment. Is this about specific needs or concerns we could address together? I asked, attempting to maintain the problem-solving approach that had characterized our relationship from its beginning. After 50 years of partnership, we've navigated countless changes and challenges by facing them collaboratively rather than individually. This isn't a negotiation or joint decision, he replied with finality that contradicted everything our relationship had represented. I've already arranged an apartment near headquarters. Alexis understands my need for independence and appreciation. At this stage of life in ways someone from your generation simply can't comprehend. The dismissal of 50 years of partnership as generational irrelevance rather than foundational strength completed the transformation that had been developing for months. The man sitting across our dining table, the table where we had made countless family and business decisions together over decades, was using language and priorities that belonged to someone entirely different from the partner with whom I had built both family and corporation. As Edward packed selected belongings that evening, his parting comments revealed how completely he had rewritten our shared history to support his current choices. I built this company and provided generously for this family for 50 years. Now it's my turn to prioritize my own happiness with someone who truly appreciates what I've accomplished. The statement's language, I built rather than we built, provided for rather than created with, exposed the fundamental reframing that enabled his current decisions. By reconstructing 5 decades of partnership as individual achievement and obligation fulfillment, he created narrative justification for choices that would have been impossible to reconcile with the actual history and values of our relationship. As his car disappeared down our driveway that evening, I sat alone in the home we had shared for 48 years, facing the most profound challenge to the partnership principles that had guided my entire adult life. The question wasn't just how to respond to personal betrayal, but how to honor the values of authentic partnership when the other party had fundamentally abandoned the shared foundation on which 5 decades of family and business had been built. In the weeks following Edward's departure, I moved through our home with the peculiar sensation of being a visitor in my own life. Rooms that had witnessed 5 decades of shared experience now echoed with absence, each familiar object transformed into artifact of a story that had abruptly changed narrative direction. The king-sized bed we had selected together 30 years earlier, the dining table where we had hosted countless family gatherings, the study where we had reviewed company reports side by side, all suddenly felt like museum exhibits documenting a history that no longer connected to present reality. Well-meaning friends offered predictable responses when I finally shared what had happened. Some suggested immediate legal action to take him for everything he's worth, before considering what that approach would mean for the company we had built together, or the values I still held despite Edward's betrayal. Others recommended overlooking the situation, pointing to countless wives of their generation who had silently endured similar indignities to maintain social standing and financial security. A few even suggested that reconciliation was inevitable once Edward got this embarrassing phase out of his system and realized what he had discarded. None of these reactions acknowledged what I instinctively recognized as the central issue. This wasn't merely about infidelity or abandonment, but about fundamental disregard for 5 decades of partnership and shared creation. The man who had once valued our mutual strengths had rewritten our entire history to position himself as sole architect of achievements we had built together. This revisionist narrative wasn't just personally painful, it threatened to distort the legacy we had constructed for our children, our employees, and the patients who benefited from the company's healthcare innovations. 3 weeks after Edward's departure, I found myself sitting across from Diana Chen, the attorney who had helped us structure the board governance transition years earlier. Though we had maintained casual friendship through occasional social gatherings, this meeting carried different purpose than our previous encounters at charity events or company celebrations. I need to understand exactly what our corporate governance structure means given current circumstances, I explained, maintaining professional tone despite the personal underpinnings of my inquiry. When we established the board and restructured ownership percentages in 1997, we were operating from assumption of continued partnership. That assumption no longer applies. Diana's expression revealed no surprise, suggesting Edward's recent behavior hadn't gone unnoticed in professional circles. "I wondered when you might contact me," she acknowledged, retrieving file from her cabinet without needing to check indexing system. The restructuring we implemented was quite specific in its provisions, though I suspect Edward may have lost sight of certain details over time. The documents she placed on the desk between us represented exactly the kind of careful planning that had characterized our approach throughout decades of building Whitfield Medical. While the public narrative presented Edward as company chairman and public face, the legal reality contained in these agreements told more complex story about actual control and decision-making authority. When we transitioned to board governance, you and Edward made deliberate choices about voting rights and control provisions, Diana explained, highlighting specific sections of agreements I had signed 25 years earlier but hadn't reviewed since implementation. While Edward holds the chairmanship title and significantly larger public profile, the controlling interest provisions were actually structured with majority effective control allocated to you through combination of direct holdings and specific family trust provisions. The confirmation of what I had generally understood but never fully quantified created momentary cognitive dissonance, the realization that despite Edward's recent revisionist narrative about his company, I actually held primary controlling interest in the enterprise we had built together. In practical terms, Diana continued with professional clarity that avoided any hint of the personal dimensions underlying our discussion, you control 62% of voting rights in any significant corporate action requiring shareholder approval. This includes executive appointments, major strategic initiatives, and any substantial reorganization or ownership changes. The precise percentage struck me as both ironic and somehow appropriate, almost exactly the proportion of our marriage that Edward had now dismissed as irrelevant constraint rather than foundational strength. For 50 years of shared life, he had unilaterally severed connection while assuming continued control of corporate entity we had constructed through genuine partnership. Edward may not fully remember these provisions, Diana observed with careful, professional neutrality. The chairmanship role and public-facing position often creates perception of unilateral authority that doesn't necessarily align with legal governance reality. Her diplomatic phrasing acknowledged what was becoming increasingly apparent. Edward had begun believing the simplified public narrative about his singular leadership, rather than remembering the actual partnership structure we had deliberately created. The man who had once valued our complementary contributions had gradually reconstructed history to position himself as sole creator, deserving exclusive benefits of our mutual work. "What options does this create?" I asked, focusing on possibilities rather than recriminations. I have no interest in vengeful actions or disruptions that would damage what we've built, but I'm equally unwilling to allow 5 decades of partnership to be erased from both personal and corporate history. Diana's response reflected the thoughtful consideration that had made her valuable advisor throughout our corporate development. "This isn't about legal constraints but about purposeful choices," she observed. "The governance structure provides authority to act in various ways, but how you exercise that authority reflects values rather than merely legal possibilities. This framing, focusing on values-based choices rather than power exercises, aligned perfectly with the partnership principles that had guided my approach throughout our marriage and business development. Despite Edward's betrayal of those principles, my response needed to reflect the values I still held, rather than merely reacting to his abandonment of them. "I need time to consider appropriate next steps," I concluded as our meeting ended. "This isn't about emotional reaction, but about thoughtful stewardship of what we've built together, regardless of how Edward now characterizes that history." The following days evolved into structured reflection process rather than reactive planning. While part of me felt justified anger at Edward's dismissal of our partnership and entitled to exercise control he clearly didn't realize I possessed, another part recognized that punitive action would contradict the very values he had abandoned. The question wasn't what I could legally do, but what approach would authentically honor the principles that had guided my life, despite their apparent abandonment by my former partner. I established daily routine that combined practical assessment with deeper reflection on purpose and principles. Each morning began with systematic review of company operations and performance, refreshing my understanding of departments and initiatives that had evolved during years when I had been less directly involved in daily management. Afternoons involved conversations with long-term employees and executives whose perspective could illuminate current company culture and operational realities beyond financial reports and organizational charts. Most valuable were evening discussions with our children, Jonathan and Catherine, who provided essential perspective untainted by either corporate politics or marital betrayal. While both were understandably angry about their father's actions and dismissive treatment of 5 decades of family partnership, they maintained balanced assessment of appropriate response that transcended emotional reaction. "Dad's behavior is indefensible," Jonathan acknowledged during particularly meaningful conversation 3 weeks after Edward's departure. "But your response shouldn't be about punishment or retribution. It should reflect the values you and Dad built the company on, even if he's currently abandoned those principles." Catherine's perspective, shaped by her international development work, added important dimension beyond family or corporate considerations. "The company provides essential medical technologies to vulnerable populations worldwide," she noted. "Any action needs to consider impact on patients and healthcare providers who depend on stable operations and continued innovation, not just family dynamics or corporate control." Their balanced wisdom, acknowledging the legitimate hurt while focusing on principled response rather than reactive action, reflected exactly the values we had attempted to transmit throughout their upbringing. While Edward might have abandoned the partnership perspective we had modeled, our children clearly embodied the principles we had taught through both instruction and example. "What's most important," Catherine observed during family dinner that brought welcome respite from solitary evenings, "is that your response represents authentic continuation of the values that built both family and company, rather than contradicting those principles despite Dad's failure to honor them." This insight crystallized the essential challenge: how to respond in a way that maintained integrity to partnership principles, even when confronting partner who had unilaterally abandoned them. The answer wouldn't come from legal leverage or emotional reaction, but from careful consideration of what response would genuinely honor the values I still embraced, despite their rejection by someone who had once shared them. The catalyst for decisive action came unexpectedly, 6 weeks after Edward's departure, through conversation with Marianne Rodriguez, the company's long-serving head of product development. We had arranged lunch ostensibly to discuss new healthcare technology initiatives. But the discussion quickly evolved beyond specific projects to broader company direction and values alignment. Something fundamental has shifted in our approach over past 18 months, Marianne observed with careful professionalism that didn't directly reference Edward's changing behavior. We've moved from patient-centered innovation toward market positioning, priorities that don't always align with actual healthcare needs. Her diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the underlying concern. Edward's changing values hadn't just manifested in personal relationship, but had begun influencing company direction in ways that contradicted founding principles we had established together. The disconnection from partnership values wasn't merely personal matter, but increasingly organizational reality affecting company culture and priorities. The restructuring proposal coming to next month's board meeting particularly concerns me, Marianne continued, referencing initiative I hadn't yet encountered in my operational reviews. It would significantly reduce investment in developing market adaptations to prioritize premium product lines for elite hospitals and private practices. The financial projections look impressive, but they fundamentally contradict our historical commitment to technologies that create broadest possible patient benefit rather than maximizing profit from those who can already afford comprehensive care. This revelation, that Edward was planning substantial revision to company's foundational healthcare access mission without any consultation, despite our 5 decades of partnership, crystallized necessary response more clearly than any legal leverage or emotional reaction could have achieved. The issue transcended personal betrayal to threaten organizational values and patient impact in ways that couldn't be addressed through quiet resignation or private settlement. That evening, I contacted Diana Chen to arrange more formal assessment of governance options and board dynamics. 2 days later, we sat in her office reviewing both legal authorities and strategic considerations that would shape appropriate intervention that respected company stability while addressing concerning value divergence. The board meeting scheduled for June 15th provides natural opportunity to address governance questions without creating organizational disruption, Diana observed. As controlling shareholder, you have clear authority to redirect strategic initiatives or leadership structures that contradict established company values. Her analysis confirmed what had become increasingly apparent through my research and conversations. Edward was attempting to implement significant shift in company direction based on values that contradicted both our historical partnership principles and the healthcare mission that had guided development for 5 decades. His unilateral action in personal relationship had evolved into equally unilateral corporate decisions that threatened organizational integrity beyond marital partnership. My concern isn't asserting control for its own sake, I explained as we developed appropriate approach. It's ensuring company maintains commitment to values that built its success, rather than abandoning them for short-term financial metrics or market positioning that contradicts founding purpose. The plan that emerged from our discussions focused on governance realignment rather than personal confrontation or punitive measures. Rather than publicly challenging Edward's authority or creating destabilizing leadership crisis, we would implement measured board-level intervention that maintained organizational stability while addressing concerning value divergence. The most appropriate response isn't dramatic confrontation, Diana advised with perspective shaped by decades of corporate governance experience. It's thoughtful realignment that ensures decision-making authority reflects both legal reality and values consistency rather than allowing unilateral action that contradicts both. This approach, focusing on systemic correction rather than personal retribution, aligned perfectly with the partnership principles Edward had abandoned, but, that I still embraced despite his betrayal. The response wouldn't be about punishing him for personal abandonment, but about preserving organizational values. He was increasingly undermining through unilateral decisions that contradicted 5 decades of collaborative development. Over subsequent days, I arranged discreet consultations with key board members whose commitment to company's healthcare mission transcended personal loyalty to either Edward or myself. These conversations revealed consistent concern about recent strategic shifts and governance approaches that had moved from collaborative decision-making toward increasingly unilateral direction by chairmen whose vision seemed increasingly focused on market positioning rather than patient impact. The company's strength has always been balancing business success with healthcare mission, observed Dr. James Williams, longest-serving independent director who had joined our board during initial governance transition. Recent quarters have shown concerning shift toward prioritizing financial metrics and market perception over substantive healthcare impact in ways that threaten long-term sustainability, even while creating impressive short-term results. Similar perspectives emerged from conversations with other board members who had observed Edward's shifting approach with professional concern that transcended any awareness of our personal situation. These discussions confirmed that appropriate response wasn't about marital grievance, but about organizational stewardship that would protect company values regardless of personal circumstances that had triggered their reevaluation. As board meeting date approached, I finalized approach with Diana's guidance, focusing on governance reset rather than leadership confrontation. Rather than publicly challenging Edward's chairmanship or creating disruptive authority dispute, we would implement measured realignment that addressed decision-making authority without creating organizational instability or unnecessary public dimension to what remained fundamentally values-based intervention. The morning of June 15th arrived with peculiar calm that often accompanies moments of profound transition. After 5 decades of partnership followed by months of betrayal and deliberation, the path forward had crystallized with surprising clarity. This wasn't about revenge or retribution, but about honoring values that remained valid despite their abandonment by someone who had once shared them. I arrived at corporate headquarters 30 minutes before scheduled board meeting, entering through executive entrance with keycard that still functioned despite my ambiguous position following Edward's departure. The boardroom remained empty aside from administrative staff arranging materials and refreshments for directors' arrival, providing momentary solitude to prepare for interaction that would undoubtedly prove challenging despite careful preparation. The corporate counsel entered first, followed by Diana, whose presence had been arranged through professional colleague relationship rather than explicit acknowledgement of her advisory role in current situation. Independent directors arrived in quick succession, followed by Edward, who entered with Alexis close behind him carrying portfolio containing presentation materials for restructuring proposal that had catalyzed this intervention. His momentary surprise at my presence quickly transformed into carefully managed professional acknowledgement, revealing how completely he had dismissed me from corporate consideration despite 5 decades of partnership in building the very enterprise he now led. The subtle dismissal, treating my presence as unusual courtesy rather than legitimate governance role, confirmed how thoroughly he had reconstructed our shared history to position himself as singular creator, deserving exclusive control of mutual creation. The meeting began with standard procedural elements: approval of previous minutes, review of quarterly performance metrics, updates on regulatory compliance matters that required board attention. Edward conducted proceedings with practiced corporate efficiency that revealed nothing of personal circumstances or governance questions that would soon emerge from carefully structured agenda progression. When discussion turned to proposed restructuring, initiative that would significantly redirect company's healthcare access commitment toward premium market positioning, I recognized appropriate moment for measured intervention that had been carefully planned with Diana's governance expertise. As Edward concluded initial presentation outlining financial benefits of strategic shift without acknowledging its divergence from historical mission, I activated the governance reality he had apparently forgotten existed. Before proceeding further, with this proposal, I stated with calm professionalism that focused on organizational values rather than personal grievance, I believe board should review proposed direction against companies' established healthcare access commitments and partnership, principles that have guided development throughout our history. Edward's expression registered momentary confusion, followed by dismissive confidence that reflected his reconstructed narrative about unilateral authority. The restructuring aligns perfectly with market evolution and shareholder value priorities, he responded with practiced executive assurance. While historical initiatives served their purpose, current marketplace requires more sophisticated positioning than legacy commitments established in different healthcare environment. His framing, positioning 5 decades of purposeful mission as outdated legacy commitments rather than foundational values, revealed how completely he had embraced revisionist narrative that contradicted genuine partnership history. The dismissal mirrored exactly the language he had used when abandoning our marriage, casting shared creation as historical constraint rather than essential foundation. As directors with fiduciary responsibility for organizational integrity as well as financial performance, I continued without directly challenging his characterization, we should consider whether proposed direction maintains appropriate balance between market success and healthcare mission that has distinguished company throughout its development. Several independent directors nodded in agreement, their expressions suggesting similar concerns about value alignment that transcended any awareness of our personal circumstances. The governance opening created space for measured intervention that would address control questions without creating unnecessary confrontation or organizational disruption. Perhaps this discussion requires more specific consideration of decision-making authorities and board responsibilities, Diana suggested with professional neutrality that avoided any hint of our prior consultations. The governance structure, established during 1997 transition, created specific provisions regarding strategic direction and mission alignment that seem relevant to current proposal. Edward's expression shifted from confident dismissal toward emerging concern as corporate counsel distributed governance summary document Diana had prepared, highlighting specific provisions regarding controlling interests and strategic decision authorities. The carefully structured presentation focused exclusively on governance facts rather than personal circumstances, maintaining professional framing that addressed organizational reality rather than marital situation. These provisions simply codify standard board authorities, Edward stated with decreasing confidence as he reviewed documentation. The restructuring direction falls clearly within executive implementation of board-approved strategy rather than requiring specific shareholder consultation or special approval thresholds. Actually, corporate counsel interjected with professional obligation that transcended any personal loyalty. The controlling interest provisions are quite specific, regarding initiatives that would substantially redirect company mission or healthcare access commitments. The proposed restructuring appears to meet threshold requiring approval by shareholders controlling minimum 60% voting interest rather than standard board majority. The precise percentage, 60%, created first visible indication that Edward might be recognizing governance reality he had apparently forgotten or dismissed. His expression shifted from confident assertion toward calculating assessment as he mentally reviewed ownership allocations established decades earlier through arrangements he hadn't revisited since implementation. As chairman and founder, my voting interest clearly satisfies any special threshold requirements, he stated with confidence that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of actual governance structure. Unless there's specific concern about procedural compliance that requires modification to approval process. The moment had arrived for governance clarification that would address control reality without unnecessary confrontation or public dimension. Diana nodded slightly, confirming appropriate timing for measured intervention that had been carefully planned to maintain organizational stability while addressing concerning value divergence. The documentation should clarify current controlling interests, I stated calmly, activating governance reality Edward had clearly forgotten existed. While Edward holds chairman position and substantial ownership percentage, the combined voting interests established through direct holdings and family trust provisions actually allocate 62% controlling interest to alternative direction. The corporate counsel reviewed relevant documentation with professional thoroughness that avoided any personal dimension while confirming governance reality that contradicted Edward's apparent assumptions. These provisions are indeed quite specific, he acknowledged with professional obligation that transcended personal loyalty. The controlling interest for special approval matters requiring 60% threshold is allocated as Mrs. Whitfield has indicated. Edward's expression transformed as governance reality penetrated revisionist narrative he had constructed about unilateral authority and singular creation. The color visibly drained from his face as he processed implications of legal structure he had apparently dismissed as irrelevant detail, rather than foundational reality, determining actual corporate control. There must be some misunderstanding regarding technical provisions, he stated with decreasing confidence. As founder and chairman who built this company, my direction on strategic matters carries definitive authority regardless of procedural technicalities. The phrasing, "I built this company," echoed exactly the revisionist language he had used when abandoning our marriage, positioning himself as singular creator rather than acknowledging 5 decades of partnership that had actually constructed both family and corporation. The parallel revealed how completely he had reconstructed shared history to justify both personal betrayal and corporate unilateralism. The governance structure established during 1997 transition wasn't about technicalities, but about purposeful design, I responded with calm professionalism that maintained focus on organizational values rather than personal grievance. It ensured company direction would maintain commitment to foundational principles, regardless of individual leadership transitions or market pressures that might otherwise compromise healthcare mission for short-term financial considerations. Several independent directors nodded in agreement, their expressions suggesting recognition of values, considerations that transcended governance technicalities or personal dynamics. The board discussion had successfully refocused on substantive organizational integrity rather than control confrontation or marital circumstances, exactly as planned through careful preparation. Given governance clarification, Diana suggested with professional neutrality that maintained focus on organizational process rather than personal dimensions, perhaps appropriate next step would be deferring restructuring proposal pending more comprehensive review of alignment with companies' healthcare access commitments and partnership principles that have guided development throughout its history. The measured suggestion, focusing on thoughtful reassessment rather than proposal rejection or leadership challenge, provided constructive path forward that maintained organizational stability while addressing concerning value divergence. The approach reflected exactly the partnership principles Edward had abandoned, but that remained valid despite his betrayal, focusing on collaborative solution rather than unilateral action or punitive response. That seems reasonable approach given governance considerations, agreed Dr. Williams, providing independent director perspective that transcended any loyalty to either Edward or myself. Maintaining balance between business success and healthcare mission has always distinguished companies' approach. We should ensure any strategic evolution preserves that essential balance rather than compromising foundational values for short-term positioning advantages. Other directors expressed similar perspectives, creating board consensus that effectively deferred restructuring proposal without requiring direct confrontation or explicit control assertion. The governance reality had been established without unnecessary drama or public dimension, creating foundation for measured realignment rather than disruptive leadership crisis. As meeting concluded with agreement to establish review committee, For assessing restructuring proposal against historical mission commitments, Edward remained unusually silent, his expression revealing continuing calculation about implications of governance reality he had clearly forgotten existed. When directors departed for scheduled facility tour, he remained behind, waiting until others had left before addressing me directly for first time since his departure 6 months earlier. "We should discuss these governance matters privately," he suggested with forced professionalism that barely concealed underlying shock at control revelation. "There appears to be some misunderstanding about authority allocations that should be clarified without unnecessary complication to organizational operations." "I don't believe there's any misunderstanding about governance structure," I responded calmly, maintaining focus on organizational values rather than personal grievance. "The documentation confirms exactly what we established together during 1997 transition, ensuring company direction would maintain commitment to healthcare mission and partnership principles, regardless of individual preferences or market pressures." His expression revealed momentary recognition, followed by calculating reassessment, as he processed implications of governance reality that contradicted narrative he had constructed about unilateral authority and singular creation. The man who had abandoned 5 decades of personal partnership while assuming continued corporate control was facing unexpected revelation that legal reality didn't align with revisionist history he had created to justify current choices. "I'm sure we can work out mutually beneficial arrangement regarding these technical provisions," he suggested, with transparent attempt at negotiated settlement that would preserve his authority, despite governance reality. "There's no need for organizational complications that might affect company stability or market perception based on procedural technicalities." The attempted negotiation, treating substantive governance reality as procedural technicality requiring mutually beneficial compromise, revealed how completely he had reconstructed reality to position legitimate authority as unreasonable technicality, rather than purposeful structure we had created together. The approach mirrored exactly his dismissal of 5 decades of marriage as constraining arrangement, rather than foundational partnership. "This isn't about negotiating compromises or creating organizational disruption," I clarified with calm determination that maintained focus on values rather than control. "It's about ensuring company maintains commitment to principles that built its success, rather than abandoning them for short-term positioning advantages or market perceptions that contradict founding purpose." As he processed response that offered principled perspective rather than negotiated settlement, I gathered materials and prepared to depart boardroom that had witnessed unexpected realignment of governance reality with legal structure. Before leaving, I delivered final observation that addressed fundamental issue underlying both personal betrayal and corporate revisionism that had necessitated today's intervention. "Some lessons about genuine partnership can't be learned from business school textbooks or executive leadership seminars," I stated without accusation, but with clear reference to values he had abandoned in both personal and professional dimensions. "They come from recognizing that lasting success depends on honoring commitments and shared creation rather than rewriting history to justify unilateral actions that contradict foundational principles." As I departed boardroom and headed toward building exit, I experienced extraordinary sense of restored alignment between values and actions that had been disrupted by Edward's betrayal and subsequent corporate revisionism. Today's intervention hadn't been about punishing him for personal abandonment or asserting control for its own sake. It had been about preserving organizational integrity and partnership principles that remained valid despite their rejection by someone who had once shared them. The governance reality revealed today would undoubtedly create continued implications for both corporate direction and personal circumstances in coming months. But walking toward building exit with restored sense of values alignment, I recognized that appropriate response to partnership betrayal wasn't vengeful reaction or bitter recrimination. It was thoughtful recommitment to principles that remained valid regardless of their abandonment by former partner who had once shared them. The days following the boardroom revelation unfolded with remarkable absence of the drama one might have expected, given the circumstances. There were no angry phone calls from Edward, no threats of legal challenges, no public declarations or corporate power plays. Instead, an almost eerie quiet descended, a pause that seemed to indicate profound recalculation rather than strategic retreat or immediate counteroffensive. I maintained my normal routines, dividing time between volunteer work at the community health clinic that had become increasingly important following my official retirement from nursing, regular dinners with friends who had provided essential support during Edward's abandonment, and continued review of company operations to better understand current state of the enterprise we had built together. The purposeful structure prevented dwelling on Edward's reaction while ensuring I remained prepared for whatever response might eventually emerge from his uncharacteristic silence. "He's consulting with attorneys," Diana predicted during our follow-up conversation 3 days after the board meeting, exploring legal options for challenging the governance structure or negotiating settlement that would preserve his authority despite controlling interest realities. Her assessment aligned with Edward's fundamental approach to challenges throughout his business career: methodical evaluation of options before implementing carefully constructed response rather than emotional reaction or impulsive countermeasures. The silence didn't indicate surrender but strategic assessment of alternatives given unexpected governance reality he had clearly forgotten existed. "Whatever approach he chooses," I observed without animosity but with clear-eyed realism, "my response will remain focused on protecting company values and healthcare mission rather than engaging in control battles or personal recriminations." This commitment, maintaining principles despite whatever challenges might emerge, guided my preparations during subsequent days as I assembled comprehensive documentation of recent corporate decisions that had diverged from historical values and mission commitments. Working with trusted executives who shared concern about company direction regardless of personal loyalty to either Edward or myself, I developed detailed analysis demonstrating how proposed restructuring would compromise healthcare access principles that had distinguished organization throughout its development. The expected confrontation arrived 1 week after the boardroom revelation, though not in form I had anticipated. Rather than legal challenge or negotiation demand delivered through attorneys, Edward requested private meeting at neutral location, upscale restaurant where we had frequently conducted business discussions with external partners throughout our decades of collaborative leadership. The choice of venue suggested professional framing rather than personal confrontation, focusing on corporate governance rather than marital grievance. Diana advised against meeting without legal representation given potential settlement discussion or negotiation attempt, but I recognized opportunity that transcended contractual considerations or governance technicalities. "This isn't about legal positioning but potential values realignment," I explained, declining her offer to accompany me. "Any meaningful resolution needs to address fundamental principles rather than merely technical arrangements or negotiated compromises." I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, selecting corner table that provided both privacy for sensitive discussion and clear sightlines, preventing unexpected approaches or interruptions. Edward appeared precisely at scheduled time, his punctuality reflecting business meeting framing rather than personal encounter. The careful grooming and premium suit projected corporate authority image that contrasted sharply with casual familiarity that had characterized our relationship throughout 5 decades of partnership. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he began, with formal politeness that established professional tone rather than personal connection. "Recent governance questions suggest need for comprehensive discussion about organizational direction and leadership structures." His phrasing, technically accurate while avoiding any acknowledgement of betrayal or revisionism that had necessitated governance intervention, revealed continuing attempt to frame situation as procedural misunderstanding rather than fundamental. Values divergence. The approach mirrored his characterization of our marriage dissolution as evolution beyond constraints, rather than abandonment of partnership principles. I appreciate opportunity for substantive discussion about company values and mission alignment, I responded, deliberately shifting focus from governance technicalities to fundamental principles. Recent strategic proposals suggest concerning divergence from healthcare access commitments and partnership approach that built organizational success. My framing, addressing values substance rather than control mechanics, visibly disrupted his prepared approach, suggesting he had anticipated negotiation about governance arrangements rather than discussion of principles underlying current situation. The momentary recalculation revealed how completely he had reconstructed recent events as technical disagreement rather than fundamental values conflict. The governance provisions established decades ago reflected different healthcare environment and market realities. He countered with executive assurance that positioned principled commitments as outdated constraints. Modern corporate success requires adaptive leadership unencumbered by historical arrangements that limit strategic flexibility in rapidly evolving marketplace. His characterization, treating purposeful value structures as obsolete limitations rather than foundational strengths, paralleled exactly his dismissal of our marriage as constraining arrangement rather than essential partnership. The consistent reframing revealed how thoroughly he had reconstructed shared history to justify current choices in both personal and professional dimensions. The governance structure wasn't about limiting flexibility, but ensuring enduring commitment to principles that transcend market fluctuations or leadership preferences, I clarified without accusation, but with firm correction of his revisionist framing. Its purpose was protecting values foundation that built company success rather than allowing short-term considerations to compromise healthcare mission that distinguished our approach from conventional medical suppliers. The deliberate use of our rather than your or my registered visibly, momentarily penetrating revisionist narrative he had constructed about singular creation and individual achievement. The reminder of actual partnership history, subtly delivered without explicit criticism of his current revisionism, created brief opening for potential reconnection with values he had increasingly abandoned in recent decisions. Market leadership requires focusing resources on highest impact opportunities rather than dispersing attention across diverse initiatives that dilute competitive positioning, he responded, retreating to executive language that avoided addressing partnership acknowledgement. The restructuring proposal represents pragmatic adaptation to current healthcare economics rather than fundamental values shift that would require special governance considerations. His continued characterization, positioning principled intervention as procedural technicality rather than legitimate values protection, confirmed how completely he had embraced revisionist narrative, justifying both personal betrayal and corporate unilateralism. The consistent reframing wasn't merely defensive posture, but fundamental perspective shift that reconstructed 5 decades of partnership as historical constraint limiting his current preferences. Recent direction changes aren't merely tactical adjustments but fundamental mission divergence, I stated with calm clarity that maintained focus on principles rather than personalities. Moving from healthcare access commitment toward premium market positioning represents values shift that contradicts founding principles established through our partnership approach throughout company development. Again, the deliberate partnership acknowledgement registered momentarily before corporate language resumed, suggesting internal conflict between narrative he had constructed to justify current choices and actual history he couldn't entirely dismiss. Despite determined revisionism, the flicker of recognition created potential opening for substantive discussion beyond governance technicalities or negotiated settlement. Perhaps we're approaching this situation from unnecessarily adversarial perspective, he suggested, shifting toward reconciliation framing that reflected assessment of limited options given governance realities. We both want company success. Despite different views about appropriate strategic direction, surely we can establish leadership arrangement that accommodates both perspectives without creating organizational disruption or marketplace uncertainty. The sudden pivot, from dismissive confidence to collaborative framing, revealed strategic recalculation rather than genuine recommitment to partnership principles. Having recognized governance reality that contradicted his assumption of unilateral control, he was now attempting negotiated settlement that would preserve his authority despite legal structure, confirming alternative decision rights. This isn't about establishing power-sharing arrangement or negotiating compromise between competing perspectives. I clarified with calm determination that maintained focus on principles rather than control. It's about ensuring company maintains commitment to values that built its success, rather than allowing mission divergence that contradicts founding purpose and healthcare impact priorities established throughout our development history. His expression revealed momentary recognition that expected negotiation about governance arrangements wasn't materializing. Instead of technical discussion about control parameters or leadership structures, the conversation had remained anchored. In values territory, he had increasingly abandoned in both personal and professional dimensions. The healthcare marketplace has fundamentally changed since company founding, he asserted with renewed executive confidence that positioned principles as historical artifacts rather than enduring commitments. Maintaining competitive relevance requires strategic evolution beyond historical constraints that limit adaptation to current realities. The principles that distinguished our approach haven't become outdated despite evolving market conditions. I responded without defensive reaction, but with clear correction of his revisionist framing. Commitment to healthcare access and substantive patient impact represents enduring value proposition rather than historical constraint limiting current opportunities. Our exchange continued through appetizers and main course, diplomatic language, barely concealing fundamental disconnect between his position, treating principled commitments as obsolete limitations, and my perspective anchoring organizational identity in enduring values despite changing market conditions. The conversation illustrated precisely the divergence that had gradually emerged in both personal relationship and corporate leadership, revealing consistent pattern transcending either dimension alone. As dessert arrived, Edward shifted approach. Again, abandoning market-focused justifications for more personal framing that directly acknowledged our shared history while attempting to separate personal circumstances from corporate considerations. Regardless of our current personal situation, he stated with careful neutrality that avoided directly referencing his abandonment for relationship with Alexis. Our 5 decades of building this company together created legacy that deserves protection from governance disputes or leadership instability. Perhaps we should consider transition arrangement that would preserve organizational continuity while acknowledging both our contributions to company development. The suggestion, offering recognition of partnership history as negotiating concession rather than fundamental acknowledgement, revealed strategic positioning rather than genuine recommitment to values he had increasingly abandoned. Having failed to frame governance reality as technical misunderstanding or outdated constraint, he was now attempting to leverage historical connection as negotiation tool while maintaining separation from personal betrayal that paralleled corporate revisionism. The issue isn't about recognition claims or contribution acknowledgments, I responded, maintaining focus on principles rather than personalities despite his attempt to separate interconnected dimensions. It's about ensuring company direction maintains alignment with values that created its distinctive approach throughout development history, regardless of current personal circumstances or leadership preferences. His expression revealed growing frustration at conversation that consistently returned to principles territory rather than governance negotiations or leadership arrangements he had apparently prepared to discuss. The determined resistance to values framing confirmed how completely he had reconstructed recent events as technical disagreement rather than fundamental mission divergence requiring principled intervention. "What exactly do you want from this situation?" he asked finally, abandoning diplomatic corporate language for direct question that revealed genuine confusion about my objectives given governance leverage I clearly possessed, but wasn't wielding in expected fashion. "You control," majority interest, but haven't attempted removing me from leadership or implementing alternative direction, despite clear authority to do so. What outcome are you actually seeking through this governance assertion? The question, revealing expectation of power play rather than principled intervention, confirmed how thoroughly he had embraced corporate gamesmanship framing that contradicted partnership approach characterizing our 5 decades of shared development. His genuine confusion about objectives beyond control exercise or negotiated settlement illustrated precisely the values divergence that had necessitated governance intervention in first place. I'm not seeking leadership position or control exercise, I explained with calm clarity that maintained focus on principles rather than personalities. I'm protecting values foundation and healthcare mission that distinguished our company throughout its development. The governance intervention wasn't about asserting authority, but preventing mission divergence that would compromise enduring commitments for short-term positioning advantages. His expression revealed genuine struggle to comprehend motivation that transcended power dynamics or negotiation leverage, suggesting he had become so thoroughly immersed in corporate gamesmanship mentality that principled intervention registered as strategic maneuver rather than values protection. The disconnect illustrated precisely how completely his understanding had shifted from partnership perspective to unilateral positioning, despite 5 decades of shared development. If you're not seeking leadership role or specific governance, changes, he questioned with persistent confusion that revealed genuine perspective limitation. What concrete outcome would resolve current situation from your perspective? Recommitment to healthcare access mission and partnership principles that built company success, I stated simply, addressing substance rather than structure or leadership arrangements. Ensuring strategic direction maintains alignment with founding values rather than sacrificing substantive impact for market positioning or premium sector advantages that contradict historical commitments. His continuing bewilderment at straightforward answer revealed how thoroughly he had embraced corporate gamesmanship framing that expected control objectives or negotiation demands rather than principled commitments. The persistent disconnect illustrated fundamental perspective shift that had gradually transformed his understanding from partnership approach to unilateral positioning, despite 5 decades of shared development. Perhaps I've underestimated your business acumen throughout our relationship, he observed with dawning recognition that wasn't entirely complimentary, despite apparent acknowledgement. This governance leverage creates negotiating position that could extract significant concessions regarding company direction or leadership structure. His interpretation, recasting principled intervention as strategic negotiation, revealed how completely he had embraced competitive framing that perceived values commitment as sophisticated leverage rather than genuine principle transcending negotiation considerations. The persistent misinterpretation illustrated precisely the perspective shift that had gradually transformed his understanding from partnership approach to unilateral positioning, despite decades of shared experience demonstrating alternative values. This isn't about negotiation leverage or strategic positioning, I clarified with patient determination that maintained focus on principles despite his persistent misframing. It's about ensuring company maintains commitment to values that created its distinctive approach throughout development history. The governance intervention wasn't establishing negotiating position, but protecting mission integrity from concerning divergence that would compromise founding principles. As conversation concluded without concrete resolution or specific agreement, Edward's expression revealed continuing calculation rather than values reconnection, suggesting strategic reassessment rather than genuine recommitment to principles he had increasingly abandoned. His departing comments confirmed tentative truce rather than substantive alignment, acknowledging governance reality without embracing values reconnection that might have created more meaningful resolution. I'll postpone restructuring proposal, pending more comprehensive review of alignment with historical commitments, he stated with careful neutrality that avoided either concession or confrontation. Perhaps we can establish review committee including both executive leadership and independent directors to evaluate strategic direction against founding principles while maintaining competitive positioning appropriate to current marketplace. The suggestion, creating structured process rather than immediate realignment, reflected strategic adaptation rather than values reconnection, acknowledging governance reality without embracing substantive recommitment to principles he had increasingly abandoned. The measured response confirmed my initial assessment that Edward's reaction would involve calculated reassessment rather than emotional counterattack or immediate surrender, despite unexpected governance revelation. That seems constructive approach toward ensuring thoughtful consideration of values alignment questions, I agreed, recognizing incremental progress despite limited reconnection with partnership principles he had increasingly abandoned. Establishing structured review process creates opportunity for substantive discussion about maintaining mission integrity while adapting to evolving healthcare environment in ways that preserve founding commitments rather than compromising them for short-term advantages. As we departed restaurants separately, maintaining professional distance rather than personal connection despite momentary opening created by substantive discussion, I recognized that meaningful resolution remained distant despite governance, intervention that had created structural foundation for potential realignment. The conversation had established procedural pathway rather than values reconnection, confirming that Edward's fundamental perspective had shifted from partnership approach to unilateral positioning despite 5 decades of shared development, demonstrating alternative principles. The subsequent weeks unfolded with careful implementation of review process established during our meeting, creating structured framework for evaluating strategic direction against historical values and founding principles. Working with independent directors and respected executives whose company commitment transcended personal loyalty to either Edward or myself, we developed comprehensive assessment methodology that examined proposed initiatives against healthcare access mission and partnership, approach that had distinguished company throughout its development. Throughout this process, Edward maintained professional engagement while preserving emotional distance, participating in structured evaluation, while avoiding substantive discussion of personal situation that paralleled corporate revisionism requiring governance intervention. This compartmentalization, treating company direction and personal behavior as separate dimensions despite consistent pattern connecting both, revealed continuing attempt to isolate dimensions that were fundamentally interconnected through common values divergence. The most significant development emerged unexpectedly through conversation with Alexis that occurred 6 weeks after boardroom revelation, during reception following healthcare industry conference, where company maintained prominent participation regardless of internal governance questions. Finding myself momentarily alone near refreshment table, I was approached by the young woman whose relationship with Edward had catalyzed current situation through personal dimension, paralleling corporate revisionism that had necessitated intervention. "Mrs. Whitfield," she began with surprising directness that contrasted with carefully neutral interactions characterizing our previous limited encounters. "I believe we should speak privately about current circumstances affecting both organizational stability and personal situations interconnected through common relationships. The unexpected approach, acknowledging interconnection between dimensions Edward had determinedly separated, created momentary surprise quickly replaced by recognition of potential opening for more substantive discussion than formalized review process had yet achieved. Despite understandable reluctance to engage with person representing catalyzing factor in painful personal betrayal, I recognized opportunity transcending emotional reaction or justified dismissal. I appreciate directness that acknowledges complex reality rather than maintaining artificial separation between interconnected dimensions. I responded with measured openness that maintained dignity while allowing potential dialogue beyond expected antagonism or defensive positioning. Perhaps we can find more private setting for conversation that requires greater confidentiality than current environment permits. We relocated to small seating area separated from main reception by architectural features, creating natural sound barrier while remaining visibly appropriate for professional interaction rather than suggesting secretive exchange. The arrangement provided necessary privacy for substantive discussion while avoiding appearance of inappropriate negotiation or confrontation that might create additional complications in already complex situation. I recognize my role in current circumstances creates understandable assumptions about my perspectives and priorities. Alexis began with surprising self-awareness that contradicted dismissive characterization Edward had consistently presented. But recent governance developments have revealed concerning patterns suggesting fundamental misalignment between Edward's representations and organizational realities that affect both company integrity and personal relationships built upon those representations. Her framing, acknowledging interconnection between professional misrepresentations and personal relationship mischaracterizations, suggested unexpected complexity, transcending homewrecker stereotype or ambitious subordinate caricature that might have simplified current situation into conventional narrative. The nuanced perspective created opening for substantive dialogue beyond justified antagonism or defensive positioning that might have characterized more predictable interaction. Edward has consistently positioned company as personal creation, reflecting individual vision rather than partnership development involving shared contributions. She continued with professional assessment that focused on pattern recognition rather than personal attack. Recent governance revelation contradicted fundamental narrative he presented throughout our relationship, suggesting concerning pattern of revisionist history affecting both organizational understanding and personal representations forming relationship foundation. This analysis, identifying consistent pattern connecting corporate revisionism with personal misrepresentation, revealed sophisticated perspective transcending romantic entanglement or ambitious positioning that might have characterized more predictable motivation. The thoughtful assessment suggested genuine concern about integrity questions, rather than merely personal interest or career advancement priorities expected from conventional homewrecker narrative. The governance structure reflects intentional design ensuring values protection rather than control limitation, I explained, responding to implied question within her observation. Its purpose was maintaining principled commitments regardless of market pressures or leadership preferences that might otherwise compromise healthcare mission for short-term positioning advantages. That framework directly contradicts narrative Edward presented about company development and leadership authority. Alexis acknowledged with recognition that addressed pattern rather than merely personal implications. He consistently characterized organization as individual creation, reflecting singular vision rather than partnership development, involving shared contributions and purposeful governance design, ensuring values continuation. Her identification of consistent misrepresentation pattern revealed unexpected ally in values protection rather than adversary in personal betrayal, creating surprising alignment, transcending justified antagonism or defensive positioning that might have characterized more predictable interaction. The shared recognition of revisionist history affecting both organizational integrity and personal relationships, built upon those misrepresentations, established unexpected common ground despite painful circumstances connecting our current situation. My relationship with Edward developed through professional interaction, where his representations about company creation and leadership authority formed foundation for personal connection. She continued with candor that acknowledged her role, while identifying broader pattern. Recent governance revelation contradicted fundamental narrative establishing relationship basis, suggesting concerning integrity questions transcending either professional positioning or personal connection alone. This acknowledgement, identifying revisionist history as relationship foundation rather than merely convenient justification, revealed sophisticated self-awareness rather than defensive positioning or victim mentality that might have characterized more predictable response to governance intervention affecting personal situation. The thoughtful assessment suggested genuine integrity commitment rather than merely strategic adaptation to changing circumstances or power dynamics. I've initiated extensive reevaluation of both professional involvement and personal relationship, based on integrity questions raised through governance revelation, she stated with surprising decisiveness that transcended expected loyalty to Edward or defensive justification of choices leading to current situation. While I can't address organizational implications beyond my limited role, I've implemented personal boundaries reflecting values clarification prompted by recognition of revisionist patterns affecting both dimensions. Her concrete response, establishing integrity-based boundaries rather than merely strategic positioning, revealed unexpected principle commitment, transcending conventional characterization as ambitious homewrecker or naive subordinate manipulated through power dynamics. The substantive reaction suggested genuine values alignment, despite painful circumstances connecting our current situation through common relationship with person demonstrating concerning revisionist patterns. The review committee has identified consistent pattern where recent strategic initiatives increasingly prioritize market positioning over healthcare access commitments that historically distinguished company approach, I shared, acknowledging her principled response with reciprocal transparency regarding organizational dimension. The governance intervention wasn't about control assertion, but protecting values foundation from concerning divergence that would compromise founding principles for short-term advantages or premium sector positioning, contradicting historical mission. Our conversation continued with remarkable absence of expected antagonism or defensive positioning that might have characterized more predictable interaction between betrayed wife and younger relationship partner. Instead, shared recognition of consistent revisionist pattern connecting corporate misrepresentation with personal relationship mischaracterizations created unexpected alignment, focused on integrity protection rather than merely emotional reaction, or strategic adaptation to power shift, resulting from governance revelation. My background in healthcare economics before joining Whitfield Medical included research focusing on access disparities affecting vulnerable populations, Alexis revealed. With personal context that contradicted ambitious opportunist characterization, Edwards' representations about company mission and values commitment initially created compelling connection, transcending merely professional opportunity or status association. The growing recognition of divergence between stated principles and actual priorities created concerning dissonance, predating governance revelation, but crystallized through that development. This unexpected dimension, revealing values alignment, contradicting homewrecker stereotype, or ambitious subordinate caricature, transformed interaction from predictable antagonism to surprising alliance focused on integrity protection, despite painful circumstances connecting our current situation. The shared commitment to healthcare access principles created common ground, transcending personal betrayal or justified resentment that might have prevented substantive dialogue beyond emotional reaction. The most concerning aspect isn't merely strategic disagreement, but fundamental revisionism affecting both organizational understanding and personal representations, I observed, acknowledging pattern recognition transcending either dimension alone. The consistent reframing, treating partnership history as individual achievement and values commitments as outdated constraints, reveals perspective shift contradicting principles that built both company success and relationship foundation, predating current circumstances. Our conversation concluded with unexpected mutual respect rather than predictable animosity, establishing tentative alliance focused on integrity protection despite painful connection through common relationship, with person demonstrating concerning revisionist patterns. The surprising alignment created potential pathway toward resolution, transcending merely governance mechanics or leadership arrangements that had dominated formal review process, without addressing underlying values questions. 2 days later, Edward requested another private meeting, his uncharacteristically urgent tone suggesting significant development beyond incremental progress, established through formal review committee. We arranged immediate conversation at neutral location different from previous restaurant meeting, selecting public garden that had featured prominently in company's community support initiatives throughout our shared leadership tenure. I understand. You've spoken with Alexis, he began without preamble once we were seated on bench overlooking botanical display our foundation had funded years earlier. She's informed me of her decision to end our relationship and resign her position effective immediately, citing integrity concerns affecting both personal connection and professional involvement. His expression revealed genuine shock rather than strategic adaptation, suggesting unexpected development, contradicting assumptions about loyal support despite governance intervention. The simultaneous personal and professional disconnection appeared to have penetrated revisionist narrative more effectively than formal review process or governance revelation alone, creating potential opening for more substantive reconsideration than previous interactions had achieved. Her decision reflects thoughtful integrity assessment rather than merely reactive positioning, I responded without satisfaction or judgment, but with fair characterization respecting her principled choice. The governance revelation raised legitimate questions about revisionist patterns affecting both organizational understanding and personal representations forming relationship foundation. His momentary silence suggested internal struggle between defensive reaction and genuine recognition, creating potential opening for substantive reconsideration beyond strategic adaptation or negotiated settlement that had characterized previous interaction. The combined impact of governance revelation and relationship dissolution appeared to have created reflective space beyond revisionist narrative, justifying both personal betrayal and corporate unilateralism, despite 5 decades of partnership demonstrating alternative principles. I've been reviewing company history documentation while preparing materials for strategic direction assessment, he stated finally, referencing formal review process established during restaurant meeting. The archival records reveal partnership, contributions, and collaborative development I had somehow reconstructed as individual achievement, despite clear evidence contradicting that narrative. This acknowledgement, recognizing revisionist history rather than merely accepting governance reality, represented first substantive step toward potential recommitment to partnership principles, rather than merely strategic adaptation to power shift resulting from controlling interest revelation. The admission addressed fundamental pattern, rather than merely technical arrangements or leadership structures that had dominated previous discussion without resolving underlying values divergence. The governance structure wasn't about constraining leadership vision but protecting values foundation that distinguished our approach throughout development history, I observed, reinforcing principled framing rather than control mechanics that had dominated previous interaction. Its purpose was ensuring enduring commitment to healthcare access mission, regardless of market pressures or leadership preferences that might otherwise compromise founding principles for short-term advantages. I've somehow reconstructed 5 decades of genuine partnership as individual achievement despite overwhelming evidence contradicting that narrative, he acknowledged with surprising candor that addressed personal dimension previously isolated from corporate considerations. The revisionist history justified choices in both professional direction and personal relationship that fundamentally contradicted principles building our success throughout shared development. This integrated recognition, acknowledging interconnected pattern rather than maintaining artificial separation between dimensions, represented significant breakthrough beyond strategic adaptation or negotiated settlement characterizing previous interaction. The admission addressed fundamental revisionism rather than merely accepting governance reality or establishing procedural response without resolving underlying values divergence. What happens now? He asked with uncharacteristic uncertainty that revealed genuine reflection rather than strategic positioning. The governance reality and relationship dissolution create practical implications requiring immediate attention beyond merely personal reconsideration or values reassessment. The review committee has established solid foundation for evaluating strategic direction against founding principles and healthcare access commitments, I responded, focusing on constructive pathway rather than recrimination or penalty despite justified grievance. That process provides structured framework for ensuring organizational alignment with values that built company success without creating unnecessary disruption or marketplace uncertainty during leadership transition planning. Leadership transition? He questioned with surprise, suggesting continued assumption about maintaining position, despite governance revelation and relationship dissolution, creating fundamentally changed circumstances. Are you planning to remove me from chairmanship despite commitment to postpone restructuring pending values alignment review? This isn't about punishment or retribution, I clarified with calm determination that maintained focus on principles rather than personalities. It's about establishing leadership approach that authentically reflects founding values and partnership principles moving forward. That transition should be thoughtfully implemented through structured process rather than reactive change. But fundamental realignment appears necessary given consistent pattern connecting revisionist history with concerning direction divergence. As our conversation continued, framework emerged for measured transition, preserving organizational stability, while addressing necessary leadership realignment, ensuring values protection, beyond merely governance mechanics or procedural adjustments. The approach focused on principled evolution rather than punitive action or personal retribution, maintaining commitment to partnership principles despite their previous abandonment by person requiring current intervention. The company deserves leadership that genuinely embodies founding values and healthcare mission rather than reconstructing partnership history as individual achievement justifying unilateral direction, I explained, addressing organizational needs rather than personal grievance despite justified resentment. The transition should be implemented through respectful process, acknowledging your contributions while establishing governance approach, authentically reflecting partnership principles. Moving forward, 6 months later, as Edward completed transition toward emeritus advisory role with appropriate recognition for contributions without continued operational leadership, I sat in boardroom witnessing installation of new executive team reflecting genuine recommitment to healthcare access mission and partnership principles. The carefully structured process had maintained organizational stability while implementing necessary realignment, ensuring values protection beyond merely governance mechanics or procedural adjustments established through initial intervention. Dr. Lydia Washington, respected physician with extensive global health experience who had previously served as independent director, assumed CEO position with explicit mandate focusing on healthcare access commitments while maintaining business sustainability. Through balanced approach, prioritizing mission alignment alongside operational excellence, Jonathan, our son whose medical research background provided ideal preparation for leadership role reflecting founding values, accepted board position ensuring family representation without nepotism concerns given his established professional credentials independent from parental connection. Most surprisingly, Alexis returned to organization in specialized role, focusing on healthcare economics research supporting access initiatives, position leveraging her academic background while establishing appropriate professional boundaries reflecting integrity, commitments rather than power dynamics or personal relationships affecting previous involvement. Her principled choice, accepting significant position reduction to maintain values alignment, demonstrated genuine commitment, transcending ambitious careerist characterization that might have simplified her motivation within conventional narrative. As board meeting concluded formalizing leadership transition and strategic realignment, ensuring values protection, I experienced extraordinary sense of completed circle connecting current resolution with partnership principles established throughout 5 decades of shared development. The governance intervention hadn't been about punishing Edward for personal betrayal or asserting control for its own sake. It had been about protecting values foundation that remained valid despite their abandonment by person who had once shared them, but gradually reconstructed. Partnership history as individual achievement, justifying unilateral direction, contradicting founding principles. Walking from boardroom toward building exit, where Edward waited to accompany me to retirement celebration, honoring his contributions. While implementing necessary transition, I reflected on journey from betrayal through deliberation toward resolution that preserved organizational integrity while maintaining personal dignity despite painful circumstances necessitating intervention. The path hadn't been about vengeance or retribution, but about thoughtful recommitment to principles that remained valid, regardless of their rejection by former partner who had once embodied them, but gradually embraced revisionist narrative contradicting shared history. You never wanted control or position despite clear authority to claim either, Edward observed as we walked together toward auditorium, where company employees waited to acknowledge leadership transition through respectful ceremony, honoring past contributions while celebrating renewed commitment to founding principles. You only wanted protection for values we established together throughout development history. I somehow reconstructed as individual achievement, despite overwhelming evidence contradicting that narrative. Some lessons about genuine partnership can't be learned through executive seminars or leadership retreats, I responded without accusation, but with clear reference to principles requiring lived commitment rather than merely intellectual understanding. They come from recognizing that lasting success depends on honoring shared creation rather than rewriting history to justify unilateral actions, contradicting foundational values that built something meaningful together. As we entered auditorium, to standing ovation, acknowledging both his contributions and necessary transition, reflecting renewed commitment to founding principles, I experienced profound gratitude transcending personal circumstances that had triggered current resolution. The governance intervention hadn't been about winning control battle or extracting revenge for personal betrayal. It had been about protecting values foundation and partnership principles that had created something worthy of preservation beyond merely individual achievement or unilateral direction, contradicting shared development history. The controlling interest he hadn't known existed hadn't been established for power exercise or leverage creation. It had been thoughtful protection, ensuring company direction would maintain alignment with founding principles, regardless of changing circumstances or leadership preferences that might otherwise compromise healthcare mission for short-term advantages, or market positioning contradicting values commitment. That purposeful governance design had ultimately preserved organizational integrity while honoring 5 decades of partnership despite their abandonment by person requiring current intervention. Some lessons about authentic partnership transcend both personal relationships and corporate structures, revealing principles that remain valid regardless of their rejection by those who once shared them, but gradually reconstruct shared history to justify choices contradicting foundational values. The most meaningful resolution isn't about punishment or retribution, but about recommitment to principles that continue building something worthy of preservation, despite painful circumstances requiring intervention, ensuring their protection from revisionist narratives that threaten both personal dignity and organizational integrity built through genuine partnership rather than merely individual achievement. 2 years after the boardroom revelation that transformed both Whitfield Medical and my personal journey, I found myself standing in the gleaming atrium of our newest facility, the Whitfield Healthcare Access Center in Detroit's Riverdale neighborhood, where I had been born 73 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on me as I gazed at the state-of-the-art medical technology center built in the working-class community that had shaped my earliest understanding of partnership and mutual support. The dedication ceremony scheduled for later that morning represented far more than typical corporate milestone or philanthropic gesture. It embodied the full-circle journey from the values my parents had instilled in our modest 2-bedroom home to the global healthcare enterprise that now recommitted to those same principles through tangible investment in underserved communities. The center would provide advanced diagnostic services and specialized care previously unavailable without lengthy travel to distant facilities, creating healthcare access that transformed possibilities for families like the one I had grown up in decades earlier. "You seem deep in thought," observed Lydia Washington, whose leadership as CEO over the past 2 years had skillfully balanced business sustainability with renewed commitment to healthcare access mission. Is everything ready for the ceremony? I was just reflecting on how perfectly this facility embodies the values that built the company, I replied, appreciating her leadership that had maintained operational excellence while restoring principled focus that had begun diverging under Edward's later direction. My father would have seen this as partnership principles made physically manifest, creating mutual benefit through investment in communities typically overlooked by traditional market calculations. Lydia nodded with characteristic understanding that transcended typical executive perspective. Her background as practicing physician before entering healthcare administration had maintained patient-centered focus often lost in corporate leadership, preoccupied with financial metrics or market positioning rather than substantive healthcare impact. The financial projections actually show surprising sustainability despite initial investment considerations that might have discouraged conventional analysis, she noted, referencing business case that had justified board approval despite premium. Facility placement in working-class neighborhood rather than affluent suburb, favored by traditional market assessment. The community partnership approach has created utilization patterns and operational efficiencies that contradict typical assumptions about facilities in underserved areas. Her observation confirmed what I had always believed throughout our company. Development that values-based decisions often created unanticipated benefits, transcending conventional business calculations focused on short-term metrics rather than sustainable impact. The principled commitment didn't merely satisfy moral considerations, but frequently yielded practical advantages overlooked by traditional analysis, prioritizing immediate returns over enduring relationships and community integration. As we continued final preparations for dedication ceremony, I noticed familiar figure entering atrium with measured pace, reflecting both physical limitations of advancing age and careful observation of facility details that revealed engineers' assessment habits maintained despite retirement from active leadership. Edward's presence wasn't entirely unexpected given scheduled participation in ceremony acknowledging company founders, but his early arrival suggested purpose beyond merely fulfilling obligatory appearance at corporate milestone. The structural design maintains accessibility without institutional aesthetic that typically characterizes medical facilities, he observed, approaching with architectural assessment that reflected professional perspective rather than personal connection. The integration of natural light and community-influenced design elements creates welcoming environment rarely achieved in healthcare settings regardless of budget considerations. His technical observation, focusing on facility characteristics rather than relationship dynamics, reflected communication pattern established since leadership transition 2 years earlier. Our interactions had maintained respectful collaboration regarding historical perspective and founder recognition, while preserving appropriate boundaries reflecting both personal history and professional transition necessitated by values divergence requiring governance intervention. The design team worked directly with community representatives throughout development process, I explained, acknowledging his observation while maintaining focus on partnership principles embodied in facility beyond merely technical excellence. The aesthetic reflects genuine collaboration rather than imposed vision, creating ownership investment from community stakeholders that transcends typical provider-recipient dynamic characterizing many healthcare initiatives. Edward nodded with recognition that addressed principle rather than merely acknowledging information, suggesting continuing evolution from revisionist perspective that had necessitated intervention toward genuine recommitment to partnership values, once embodied before gradual divergence. His thoughtful consideration reflected significant journey from defensive positioning during initial governance revelation toward authentic reconnection with principles previously abandoned. I've been reviewing company history documentation while preparing remarks for today's ceremony, he shared, indicating folder containing notes for scheduled comments acknowledging founder contributions alongside current leadership. The archival materials reveal consistent pattern demonstrating how partnership approach yielded benefits, transcending what either individual vision could have achieved despite my periodic attempts to reconstruct that history through individual achievement lens. This acknowledgement, addressing fundamental pattern rather than merely specific incidents, represented continuing evolution beyond initial recognition, following governance intervention toward deeper understanding, transcending circumstantial acceptance. The reflection suggested genuine recommitment to principles rather than merely strategic adaptation to change circumstances following necessary leadership transition. The partnership created possibilities neither of us could have envisioned independently, I acknowledged, validating his observation while maintaining perspective, honoring shared history without diminishing necessary accountability for values divergence requiring intervention. The complementary strengths and balanced perspective prevented limitations that often characterize individually driven organizations, regardless of founder capabilities or market advantages. Our conversation continued with remarkable absence of tension or defensive positioning that might have characterized interaction between estranged partners following governance confrontation and necessary leadership transition. Instead, shared recognition of partnership principles that had built company success created foundation for meaningful exchange, transcending personal grievance or corporate politics, despite justified concerns requiring previous intervention. I owe you an apology beyond merely professional acknowledgement of governance misunderstanding, Edward stated suddenly, shifting from facility assessment toward personal accountability, with directness rarely demonstrated since events necessitating intervention. My gradual reconstruction of our shared history as individual achievement represented fundamental betrayal, transcending either personal relationship or corporate leadership alone. The unexpected statement, addressing core pattern rather than merely specific actions, created momentary silence reflecting significance transcending typical corporate communication or polite reconciliation gestures. The acknowledgement addressed fundamental revisionism rather than merely accepting consequences or adapting to changed circumstances following necessary intervention. The revisionist narrative didn't emerge suddenly, but developed gradually through incremental perspective shifts I barely recognized until governance revelation created unavoidable confrontation with partnership reality I had systematically dismissed. He continued with remarkable self-awareness that reflected significant internal work beyond merely external adaptation. The pattern affected both personal relationship and corporate leadership through consistent reconstruction of shared creation, as individual achievement justifying unilateral decisions contradicting foundation principles. This integrated recognition, acknowledging interconnected pattern rather than maintaining artificial separation between dimensions, represented significant evolution beyond initial defensive reaction or strategic adaptation following governance intervention. The reflection addressed fundamental perspective shift, rather than merely accepting consequences or negotiating settlement without resolving underlying values divergence. What disturbs me most in retrospect isn't the governance misunderstanding, but my genuine belief in revisionist history contradicting overwhelming evidence of partnership reality. He acknowledged with painful honesty that addressed internal perspective rather than merely external circumstances. I had somehow convinced myself that 5 decades of documented collaboration represented supportive contribution to my individual vision, rather than genuine partnership creating possibilities. Neither could have achieved independently. The acknowledgement, addressing psychological pattern rather than merely practical consequences, revealed remarkable growth beyond defensive positioning or strategic adaptation, characterizing initial response to governance intervention. The reflection suggested genuine recommitment to principles, rather than merely accepting reality or negotiating settlement without resolving underlying perspective shift requiring correction. Recognition often requires disruption that forces confrontation with reality, contradicting comfortable narratives we construct to justify desired actions. I observed without accusation. but with honest assessment addressing pattern rather than merely specific incidents. The governance intervention wasn't about control assertion or punishment delivery, but creating necessary interruption of revisionist progression that had gradually transformed partnership history into individual achievement. Narrative justifying unilateral decisions. Edward nodded with genuine acceptance rather than strategic agreement, his expression revealing continued internal processing, transcending either defensive reaction or calculated positioning that might have characterized more limited response to necessary intervention. The thoughtful consideration suggested authentic reconnection with principles, rather than merely accepting consequences without addressing underlying perspective shift requiring correction. Alexis contacted me recently, he shared unexpectedly, referencing person whose relationship had catalyzed personal dimension, paralleling corporate revisionism requiring governance intervention. She's completed graduate program in healthcare, economics, and accepted research position with University Medical Center focusing on access disparities affecting vulnerable populations. Her dissertation examining community partnership models for medical technology distribution cited Whitfield, Healthcare Access Initiatives as case study demonstrating sustainable approach transcending traditional market calculations. This update, focusing on professional development reflecting values alignment rather than personal relationship dynamics, revealed continuing evolution beyond initial circumstances toward meaningful resolution addressing underlying principles, rather than merely specific situations. The information acknowledged her genuine commitment, transcending conventional characterization, as ambitious homewrecker or naive subordinate, recognizing substantive contribution beyond merely relationship. Catalyst. Her research focus reflects authentic commitment to healthcare access principles that initially created connection beyond merely professional opportunity, I acknowledged, respecting her integrity despite painful role in circumstances requiring intervention. The dissertation contribution demonstrates genuine values, alignment transcending personal relationship dynamics that complicated original interaction before governance revelation created necessary clarification. Our conversation paused as Catherine approached, her expression reflecting both pleasure at our civil interaction and protective assessment, ensuring appropriate boundaries, maintaining necessary accountability despite apparent reconciliation gestures. Her measured greeting acknowledged Edward's presence while establishing subtle support, communicating continued awareness of history, necessitating intervention despite current collaborative appearance. The community representatives have arrived for pre-ceremony briefing, she informed us with professional courtesy, maintaining focus on current responsibilities rather than past circumstances. They've requested opportunity to share neighborhood perspectives regarding facility impact beyond merely healthcare provision before formal program begins. That conversation represents exactly the partnership approach distinguishing our development history, I responded, appreciating opportunity emphasizing community collaboration rather than corporate provision. Their insights regarding integrated impact will provide valuable perspective, transcending merely technical assessment or utilization metrics typically dominating facility evaluations. As Catherine guided us toward meeting room where community leaders awaited conversation before public ceremony, Edward offered observation, reflecting continuing evolution beyond revisionist perspective that had necessitated intervention toward genuine recommitment to partnership principles temporarily abandoned during period requiring correction. The most meaningful legacy isn't physical facilities or financial success, but values transmission, creating sustainable impact beyond individual contributions or limited timeframes. He noted, with wisdom reflecting significant journey from defensive positioning during governance revelation toward authentic reconnection with principles previously embodied. The partnership approach ensures continued development transcending specific leadership or particular circumstances, creating enduring contribution beyond merely personal achievement or corporate milestones. This observation, addressing fundamental values rather than merely specific accomplishments, represented remarkable evolution beyond revisionist narrative that had necessitated intervention toward genuine recommitment to principles once embodied before gradual divergence requiring correction. The reflection suggested authentic reconnection with partnership perspective, temporarily abandoned during period necessitating governance intervention. The meeting with community representatives unfolded with extraordinary energy, reflecting genuine collaboration rather than merely ceremonial inclusion or obligatory consultation, characterizing many corporate community initiatives. Local business owners, neighborhood association leaders, healthcare providers, and education representatives shared integrated perspective regarding facility impact beyond merely medical services provision, emphasizing economic development, education, partnership, transportation infrastructure, and community identity benefits, transcending traditional healthcare facility assessment. Their enthusiasm, reflecting authentic partnership rather than merely recipient appreciation, demonstrated exactly the principle Edward had just identified regarding meaningful legacy transcending physical facilities or financial metrics. The community ownership investment created sustainability foundation beyond merely technical excellence or operational efficiency, establishing integrated relationship, ensuring continued evolution, reflecting neighborhood needs rather than merely corporate priorities or market calculations. As formal dedication ceremony approached, guests began filling atrium with remarkable diversity, reflecting both healthcare industry representation and community participation beyond merely official delegates or corporate partners. The audience composition demonstrated genuine integration, transcending traditional boundaries, often separating professional conferences from community celebrations, creating shared ownership experience rather than merely corporate milestone observation. Behind, temporary podium established for official remarks, display panels presented company history through carefully curated photographs and artifacts documenting 5 decades of development from regional medical supplier toward global healthcare technology. Organization. The visual narrative emphasized partnership approach, transcending either individual contribution, presenting balanced representation, ensuring accurate history beyond revisionist narrative, temporarily embraced during period requiring governance. Intervention. Most striking was central image showing Edward and myself reviewing early product prototype with hospital nursing staff during company's initial development phase 50 years earlier. The photograph captured essential partnership moment, reflecting complementary contributions, his engineering expertise alongside my healthcare perspective, creating integrated approach transcending either individual capability. The visual representation embodied exactly the collaborative foundation temporarily obscured during revisionist period, requiring correction through governance intervention. As ceremony began with welcome from community representative rather than corporate executive, deliberate, sequencing emphasizing partnership approach, I found myself reflecting on extraordinary journey from working-class neighborhood, whose values shaped my understanding of meaningful relationship toward global enterprise, now recommitting to those same principles through tangible investment in similar communities typically overlooked by traditional market calculations. The full circle connection wasn't merely symbolic, but substantive demonstration that values maintaining integrity through challenging circumstances ultimately create opportunities transcending what revisionist narratives or unilateral approaches could achieve despite temporary advantages gained through principle abandonment. The governance intervention hadn't been about control assertion or retribution delivery, but about protecting value foundation, creating possibilities beyond merely individual achievement or limited timeframes. When my turn for remarks arrived following community representatives and current leadership acknowledgments, I approached podium with extraordinary clarity regarding message transcending either personal vindication or corporate positioning. The governance revelation that had catalyzed necessary transformation represented merely structural mechanism enabling principal protection rather than defining meaningful legacy established through partnership approach, temporarily abandoned during period requiring intervention. The facility we dedicate today represents far more than physical infrastructure or corporate milestone, I began, addressing integrated audience reflecting both healthcare industry representation and community participation. It embodies partnership, principles that distinguished our approach throughout 5 decades of development, creating mutual benefit through collaborative investment, recognizing diverse contributions beyond merely individual capabilities or limited perspectives. The subsequent remarks emphasized how partnership approach had consistently yielded benefits, transcending what either individual vision could have achieved despite periodic attempts to reconstruct history through singular achievement lens. The message acknowledged both Edwards' essential contributions and necessary governance intervention without allowing either dimension to overshadow fundamental principle demonstration embodied through current facility establishing meaningful legacy beyond merely personal circumstances or corporate politics. The most valuable creation isn't technology innovation or market position, but sustainable approach ensuring continued development beyond specific leadership or particular time frame, I concluded, reinforcing message transcending either personal, vindication, or corporate positioning. The partnership principles established throughout our history remain foundation for future possibilities, transcending any individual contribution or temporary circumstance, creating lasting legacy through values transmission rather than merely physical facilities or financial metrics. As Edward approached podium for his scheduled remarks, acknowledging founder perspective alongside current leadership recognition, his expression revealed genuine recommitment rather than merely diplomatic accommodation or strategic positioning. The thoughtful consideration suggested authentic reconnection with principles temporarily abandoned during period requiring intervention rather than merely accepting consequences without addressing underlying perspective shift necessitating correction. My greatest contribution wasn't technical innovation or business development, but participating in partnership, creating possibilities I couldn't have envisioned independently, despite periodic attempts to reconstruct that history through individual achievement lens, he acknowledged with remarkable candor, transcending either corporate politeness or calculated positioning. The governance structure establishing necessary correction when my perspective temporarily diverged from founding principles represents exactly the thoughtful protection ensuring sustainable development beyond specific leadership limitations, or particular circumstances affecting any individual contributor regardless of position or history. This acknowledgement, addressing fundamental pattern rather than merely specific incidents, represented extraordinary evolution beyond defensive reaction or strategic adaptation, characterizing initial response to governance intervention. The reflection demonstrated genuine recommitment to principles rather than merely accepting reality or negotiating settlement without resolving underlying perspective shift, requiring correction through structural mechanism. Fortunately established during period maintaining partnership approach before temporary divergence necessitated intervention. Following ceremony and reception, celebrating facility dedication, while honoring both founding contribution and current leadership. I found quiet moment in small garden area established behind building as community gathering space, reflecting neighborhood input, prioritizing natural environment within urban healthcare setting. The peaceful setting provided welcome respite from social interaction while offering perspective opportunity regarding journey from betrayal through intervention toward meaningful resolution, transcending either personal grievance or corporate politics. Edward approached with respectful distance, maintaining appropriate boundaries while indicating conversation interest if welcome, rather than assuming engagement right, despite ceremonial collaboration, suggesting potential reconciliation beyond merely professional accommodation. His measured approach reflected continuing acknowledgement of necessary accountability, despite apparent recommitment to principles temporarily abandoned during period requiring intervention. The community representative mentioned neighborhood development initiative they're organizing to complement healthcare facility with affordable housing and small business incubator. He shared, offering substantive topic reflecting current circumstances, rather than past situations or relationship speculation. They've requested technical assistance regarding structural assessment for potential renovation projects, converting abandoned industrial buildings into mixed-use developments supporting neighborhood revitalization alongside healthcare access improvements. The practical focus, addressing current opportunity rather than past grievance, created natural collaboration possibility transcending either personal history or corporate politics while maintaining meaningful contribution aligned with partnership. Principles currently re-embodied following necessary intervention, correcting temporary divergence. The approach demonstrated genuine recommitment rather than merely strategic positioning or calculated reconciliation attempt. That initiative represents exactly the integrated approach distinguishing genuine community partnership from merely transactional relationship or limited service provision. I responded, engaging substantive topic rather than relationship dynamics or past circumstances. The housing and economic development components address fundamental determinants affecting healthcare outcomes beyond merely medical services, creating sustainable improvement through integrated approach rather than isolated intervention, regardless of technical excellence or resource allocation. Our conversation continued with remarkable focus on principle application rather than personal reconciliation or relationship speculation that might have characterized more conventional interaction between estranged partners following governance, confrontation, and necessary leadership transition. The substantive exchange demonstrated genuine values, alignment, transcending either emotional reaction or strategic calculation, despite justified concerns requiring previous intervention. I've been considering appropriate contribution balancing technical expertise with respectful boundaries, maintaining necessary accountability, despite apparent recommitment to principles temporarily abandoned during period requiring intervention. Edward acknowledged with self-awareness reflecting significant journey from defensive positioning during initial governance revelation. The structural engineering background could provide valuable perspective, without suggesting leadership role or control position inappropriate, given history necessitating correction through governance mechanism, fortunately established during partnership period before temporary divergence. This thoughtful consideration, addressing appropriate contribution while maintaining necessary accountability, demonstrated remarkable evolution beyond revisionist narrative or unilateral positioning characterizing period requiring intervention. The reflection suggested genuine recommitment to partnership principles rather than merely strategic adaptation or calculated positioning, attempting relationship advantage despite history necessitating correction. The technical contribution would provide valuable expertise while modeling appropriate boundaries, demonstrating genuine recommitment beyond merely strategic positioning or calculated gesture, I acknowledged, validating substantive offering, while maintaining necessary accountability despite apparent reconciliation indications. The community development perspective deserves comprehensive support, transcending either personal history or corporate politics, creating opportunity, demonstrating partnership principles beyond merely individual contributions or limited timeframes. As afternoon concluded with practical discussion regarding appropriate engagement structure ensuring valuable contribution while maintaining necessary boundaries, I experienced extraordinary clarity regarding journey from betrayal through intervention toward meaningful resolution, transcending either personal grievance or corporate politics. The governance mechanism revealing controlling interest he hadn't known existed had created necessary disruption, interrupting revisionist progression while establishing foundation for principle recommitment beyond merely consequence acceptance or strategic adaptation. Walking through facility before departing, observing integrated design reflecting both technical excellence and community partnership, I recognized that meaningful legacy transcended either governance revelation or leadership transition that had temporarily dominated attention during intervention period. The enduring contribution wasn't controlling interest disclosure or consequence implementation, but values transmission, creating sustainable approach, ensuring continued development beyond specific circumstances or particular individuals. 2 months later, watching community volunteers planting gardens surrounding newly established housing development adjacent to healthcare facility. Project benefiting from structural assessment Edward had provided through appropriate advisory role maintaining necessary boundaries. I experienced profound gratitude transcending either personal vindication or corporate positioning that might have characterized more limited resolution following betrayal, requiring intervention. The governance structure revealing control he hadn't recognized existed hadn't been established for power exercise or retribution delivery, but for principle protection, ensuring sustainable development, transcending either individual limitations or temporary circumstances affecting any particular contributor, regardless of position or history. The thoughtful mechanism had created necessary interruption when revisionist progression threatened value foundation, establishing correction opportunity beyond merely consequence implementation or leadership transition. The community garden taking, shape through partnership, reflecting principles temporarily abandoned during period. Requiring intervention represented genuine legacy, transcending either personal relationship or corporate leadership alone. The enduring contribution wasn't controlling interest revelation or governance mechanism implementation, but values transmission, creating sustainable approach, ensuring continued development beyond specific circumstances or particular individuals, affected by temporary divergence, fortunately corrected through structural protection established during period maintaining partnership principles before revisionist progression required intervention. Some lessons about meaningful partnership transcend either personal relationships or corporate structures, revealing principles creating lasting impact. Beyond merely individual contributions or limited timeframes, the genuine legacy isn't governance revelation exposing control surprisingly maintained, or consequence implementation following betrayal requiring intervention. Its values transmission, establishing sustainable approach, ensuring continued development, through partnership principles creating possibilities, transcending what either individual vision could achieve, despite periodic attempts to reconstruct shared history through achievement. Lens temporarily obscuring essential foundation requiring protection through mechanisms fortunately established before revisionist progression necessitated correction, revealing control he hadn't known existed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.